this. This class is going to be recorded, as have been the first two classes. And if you missed them, all you have to do is go to our website under Serving Others. You'll see Anti-Racism. Click on that, and then click on the button for this class, and all the videos will be right there for you. So you can catch up, or if you have to leave early on this one, just go ahead and you can pick up online when it's posted. I'll try to post it as soon as the class is done for anybody. And you can also invite your friends and other folks in your congregations, your neighborhood, apartment buildings, whatever, to that. Reminder that any questions you might have, please hold till the end. And you can either type them in the chat, and I will at that point read them off, or you can raise your hand using the little function down sort of in the lower right under reactions. If you click on that, there's a little button to raise your hand. If you're on your phone, it's located near the same area in the lower right where the three little berries are, and you click on that and you can raise your hand, and I'll call on people that way. And you can take yourself off mute for the question and put yourself back on when you're done. So I don't think I have anything else, Sue. So with that business taken care of, I can turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Patrick.
Yep.
Good to see you all today, or at least as many of you as I can see on my screen at the moment. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to share this time with you as together we explore racism in America, the history we didn't learn in school. Today, we focus on part 3 of 6, 20th century public policy and the civil rights movement. This marks a period when racism in society and public policy spread well beyond the South, in part because of population shifts like the Great Migration, and in part because of the outsized influence of Southern politicians in forming, crafting public policy. All of this was undergirded by our country's perpetuation of the myth of racial inferiority. Other countries with similarly sordid pasts have sought to move forward by a process called truth and reconciliation. America's in desperate need of such a process, and so we in this class series are embarked on a search for more truth to serve as the basis for action going forward. Much of our history is painful, as we have already seen, incomprehensible even, especially for those of us who profess to believe that everyone is a child of God and that we are good people who seek peace and justice for all. Much of this history isn't just history, but is alive and pervasive in our society today. I believe that in bringing to light this aspect of our country's past that we should have known but didn't, and seeing its impact on our country even today, we may develop a new or renewed urgency to act, to finally and truly address these profound inequities. So let's continue. To begin with a brief recap of last week, we learned about the unchecked power of white supremacy, especially in the South. We learned about violence that happened during Reconstruction, even while the states were occupied by federal troops. We came to understand the insidious application of the 13th Amendment that allowed for the passage of laws called Black Codes that resulted in significant incarceration of African Americans and the economic process known as convict leasing. In 1896, we saw the impact of the Supreme Court decision in Plessy v. Ferguson that made separate but equal the law of the land and enabled Jim Crow laws to enact punitive segregation that continued for decades. We saw the horror of the terror spectacle lynchings and understand that even today there is still no federal law that outlaws or declares lynchings illegal, and that they involve the complicity of the whole community. These were not quiet actions taken in the middle of the night, but were attended by governors and mayors and police chiefs. And as a consequence of the terror and the lack of economic opportunity and the demand for workers in the North, began the Great Migration from 1916 to 1970, when more than 6 million African Americans left the South to head to the North and East and West. And throughout all of this period of time, there was an overwhelming emphasis on disenfranchisement of Black male voters. And we see that being replicated today for all African Americans, particularly, well, not even particularly in the South. Is it either 23 or 43 states are now in the process of enacting laws that constrain voting. So as we move to the mid-20th century and look at aspects of public policy that reflect our racist past, we're going to look at areas of housing, of Social Security, the GI Bill, our education, and the interstate highway system. And then we'll turn our attention to the heroic actions of civil rights activists and the key pivotal events of the civil rights movement and its impact. So to begin with housing, until 1917, cities mandated areas where Blacks could live, virtually everywhere. You can live here, you cannot live there. And there was a Supreme Court case that year, Buchanan v. Worley, that emanated from Louisville. And the Supreme Court ruled that this action by the cities to mandate these residential areas violated the 14th Amendment. And so you might think that that segregation would have stopped, but indeed it did not. And so in most everywhere, the housing market transitioned to what was known as racially restricted deed covenants. These were clauses in property deeds that specified that the property could only be sold to another white person. There was an appeal to the Supreme Court, and in 1926, in Corrigan v. Buckley, the Supreme Court issued another of its equitable rulings, and they said, yeah, that's okay. You can do that. Because remember, in an earlier case, when a violation of the 14th Amendment was asserted, the court said that the 14th Amendment only applied to actions by government and not by individuals. So if you decided to have a racially restricted deed covenant for your property, that was okay. And as a consequence, by 1940, 80% of the property deeds in Chicago and Los Angeles and 85% of Detroit properties carried these racially restricted deed covenants. Once again, appeal was made to the Supreme Court in 1948, and in Shelley v. Kramer, the Supreme Court said, yes, indeed, we told you in 1926 it was okay to do this, it's still okay to do this. And it was not until 1968, with the passage of the Fair Housing Act, that these racially restricted deed covenants were declared unconstitutional. But by that time, 50 years had gone by where these covenants kept African Americans from purchasing properties that were owned by whites and further exacerbated the problems with residential segregation. In the midst of all of this, excuse me, the Great Depression had created a significant negative effect on housing in the United States. Excuse me just a sec. And so there was literally a home ownership crisis. Houses weren't being built. And as a consequence, all of the relevant or related aspects of the economy were negatively impacted by this lack of home building. And a lot of it was due to the way that homes were purchased before the Great Depression. If you wanted to buy a house, you needed to make a sizable down payment. And in general, if you got a loan, you had to pay it back within 10 years. And particularly given the economic consequences of the Great Depression, that made it extremely difficult. So Congress in 1934 enacted the National Housing Act, which created the Federal Housing Administration. Now, the Federal Housing Administration did not issue mortgages, it insured them. And so banks and other commercial lending institutions issued the mortgages. But if you qualified for an FHA mortgage, then the FHA would insure the mortgage and minimize the risk that the bank was taking in giving you the money to purchase your home. At the same time, an entity known as the Homeowner Loan Corporation created what they called residential security maps for 239 cities across the country. Now, security had nothing to do with how safe was the neighborhood, how safe was the property. It had to do with how safe was the money that had been granted in giving a mortgage. And so here's an example of one of the residential security maps. This one is Atlanta, Georgia. And it is these maps that gave birth to the term redlining. And the way it worked was that every city was color-coded by different geographic areas. And there was an assessment made as to how secure a mortgage might be, how secure a bank might feel in getting its money back if it issued a mortgage in these parts of the cities. And so green, and you see not a lot of green in Atlanta, some up at the north, that was labeled best. So no problem issuing mortgages there. Blue, the description was still desirable, but starting to edge into some uncomfortable areas for the lenders. Yellow was described as definitely declining, and red was categorized as hazardous. Not hazardous to live there, but hazardous to lend there. And the terminology that was used to describe these different areas utilized vocabulary like infiltration of populations that were subversive or undesirable or inharmonious or lower grade. And interestingly, there is a website available even today called Mapping Inequality that shows 150 of these cities and the impact now of these residential security maps 85 years ago. So to make all of this work, you had FHA underwriters who would go out to see the property and determine whether or not the FHA would insure the mortgage that the bank was going to make. And there was an underwriter's manual, and it was hundreds of pages long, and it contained sections like, deed restrictions are apt to prove more effective than a zoning ordinance in providing protection from adverse influences. Where the same deed restrictions apply over a broad area, and where these restrictions relate to racial occupancy, a favorable condition is apt to exist. Further, the valuator should investigate areas surrounding the location to determine whether or not incompatible racial and social groups are present, to the end that an intelligent prediction may be made regarding the possibility or probability of the location being invaded by such groups. If a neighborhood is to retain stability, it is necessary that property shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. The social class of the parents of children at the school will in many instances have a vital bearing. Schools should be appropriate to the needs of the new community, and they should not be attended in large numbers by inharmonious racial groups. Recorded deed restrictions should strengthen and supplement zoning ordinances, and to be really effective, should include the 9 provisions listed below, including prohibition of the occupancy of properties except by the race for which they were intended. And as you can imagine, the proportion of mortgages issued to African American potential home buyers was a tiny fraction of those granted to white Americans. And even more significant, these same provisions were adopted by the Veterans Administration in implementing the GI Bill following World War II. And we'll talk about that a little more in a few minutes. So what was an African American family to do if they wanted to buy a house and they couldn't get a mortgage? Well, a new financial instrument was created by speculators known as contract for deed. And it was an arrangement offered by these speculators who bought properties expressly for this purpose. It required a down payment and regular monthly installments from the occupant, but that's where the similarities to a mortgage ended. The sale price and effective interest rate tended to be highly inflated because these were people who were unable to buy homes on the open market. The buyer assumed all the responsibilities of a homeowner, including paying taxes and making necessary repairs and enhancements to the property, and the seller retained the title. So the prospective buyer had no equity. And indeed, the conditions of the contract frequently said that if a single contract payment was missed, the homeowner or the resident could be evicted and lose all of the payments that had previously been made. Some of these speculators hired Black women to go into the blue and the yellow areas on the residential security maps and push baby carriages up and down the street. And then an agent of the contractor would knock on doors and say, you know they're coming, and you don't want to be the last person selling your house after they get here. And so they would buy up properties at below market rates and then inflate the purchase price for the contract for deed. Without any equity, not only did any appreciation of wealth not occur, but they didn't have the funds often for the sorts of home improvement projects that would keep up the condition and the nature of their homes. Often at the end of the contract, the person who thought they now owned the home would be presented with an insurance bill of several $1,000s. And if they could not pay it, then the contract again was declared void. And you see the echoes of this approach in the subprime mortgage crisis of 2008, when African American home buyers were disproportionately impacted by that financial instrument as well. And so all of this continued until it was outlawed by the Fair Housing Act of 1968. So for more than 50 years, in huge numbers, African Americans were locked out of the housing market. And in fact, even after being declared unconstitutional in 1968, these sorts of approaches continued, with redlining practices being adopted by private real estate agents in some cases. Now, there are real estate offices and agencies that are scrupulous in adhering to the Fair Housing Act conditions, but there are others that are not. And I don't know if you saw the news article lately where a mixed race couple put their house up for sale, and they had an appraisal done. And the wife was at home when the appraisal occurred. And when they got the number, it was about $150,000 less than they expected based on what they knew of other sales in the community. And so they hired another appraiser to come to give them, another point of view. And when that appraiser came, the husband was home. And that time, the appraisal came in about $140,000 higher than the first appraisal. The wife was Black, the husband was white. And so we still see the consequences of the racism in general and its impact on real estate and home ownership and wealth appreciation. In fact, in 2015, HCSB paid a $33 million fine for violating the Fair Housing Act in New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania, and other violations are still coming to light. So what are the consequences of this housing segregation? Well, this deliberately implemented housing policy exacerbated the housing segregation that had already existed in the South because of Jim Crow laws. This meant that huge levels of housing segregation occurred even in those states that didn't have Jim Crow laws. And that housing segregation led to educational segregation. In many municipalities, schools are funded by property taxes. And so the reduced value of homes in these cities meant less funds available to support schools and the education of minority children. And then that led to the educational inequality that we see, which impacted people's ability to get higher paying jobs and the economic impact on their families. And indeed, by not being able to take advantage of the movement to the suburbs after World War II and being kept within the city limits, there has been an environmental and a health impact on people who continue to live in center city areas that are heavily segregated. And as a consequence of all of this, the Black to white wealth ratio is 5%. A Black family on average will have a level of wealth that is 5% that of the average white family. And the income ratio is 60%. In fact, between 1984 and 2009, the racial wealth gap between Black and white Americans tripled. And today, on average, 41% of African American families own homes, and 73% of white families do. Other public programs implemented during the 20th century, the Social Security Act of 1935. Title II, many of us are familiar with Title II, although I think that term old age needs to be changed. Anyway, part of Title II excluded domestic and farm workers from the Social Security program. And at the time it was enacted, 65% of African Americans worked as domestic and farm workers. You'll remember from our previous class that when the Black codes and Jim Crow laws were passed, they specified that the former slaves and their descendants could only serve as domestic and farm workers unless they paid an annual fee to have a license for some other occupation. Now in 1950 and 1954, Congress attempted to take some steps that would expand access to the Social Security bill, but its history meant that there are huge numbers of people still not engaged, not covered by Title II. And the other programs included in the Social Security Act were handled as block grants to the states for local administration. And so you can imagine, as dollars were sent to the states, particularly the states that still had Jim Crow laws in effect, what the proportional allocation of the funds from those block grants, how they were distributed. So then in 1944, we come to the Servicemen's Readjustment Act as World War II was coming to an end. And it was assessed to be the most race-neutral benefit plan ever enacted by Congress. It provided for mortgages and other loans and education benefits for veterans. But a Southern Senator, Rankin, in order to assure his and his cohorts from the South support of the GI Bill, enacted or included a clause that said that the GI Bill would be implemented locally, and there would be no federal oversight of the GI Bill. And so as a consequence, in implementing the GI Bill, there was widespread discrimination in housing. As I indicated, the VA had adopted the same philosophy as the FHA. There was discrimination in education. It was intended to provide access to higher education for veterans. But for a number of reasons, including the economic condition of returning veterans who might not be able to take time to further their education because they needed to work, or who had attended segregated schools that did not give them the education necessary to prepare them for higher education. But even more importantly, as the GI Bill was implemented for education, white veterans were steered toward colleges and Black veterans were steered toward vocational schools. Even if a Black veteran had wanted to go to college, pretty much the only schools that they could go to were the historically Black colleges and universities that were inundated with requests from Black veterans who did indeed want to go on with their education. Colleges in the North, colleges and universities in the North tended to have quotas, the maximum number of Black veterans that they would admit, actually the number of Black students that they would admit. And colleges and universities in the South, outside these historically Black institutions, wouldn't admit Black students at all. And extending even beyond that, when Black veterans went to vocational schools, there are numerous instances, largely in southern cities, where the equipment and the facilities used to train for the vocation were reserved for the use of white students and not available to the Black veteran students who attended. And so all of this continued to intensify segregation with all of its significant economic consequences. There were 1.2 million African-American veterans after World War II who were negatively affected by the implementation of the GI Bill. And once again, post-war, we saw the violence against Black veterans. There were instances of Black veterans in uniform being lynched in 1946 and 1947. On the evening of February 12th, 1946, Isaac Woodard, who was a 26-year-old Black Army veteran, boarded a bus in Augusta, Georgia. Earlier that day, he'd been honorably discharged and he was heading to Winnsboro, South Carolina to rejoin his wife. The bus driver made a stop en route and Woodard asked if he had time to use the bathroom. And the bus driver cursed at him. And as Isaac admitted later, he cursed back. Neither man said anything after that until the bus stopped in Batesburg, South Carolina. There, the driver got out and told the local police about Woodard's impudence. He was ordered off the bus. When Woodard tried to give his version of events, a police officer struck him with a nightclub. He was escorted to jail, where he later testified he was repeatedly beaten by the police chief, Linwood Scholl. Woodard said that Scholl pounded him in his eyes with the end of the nightstick until he blacked out. Once he regained consciousness, he could not see. He was charged with disorderly conduct, with the police claiming he'd been intoxicated, but witnesses said he had had nothing to drink. He had to pay a fine, and after he did, he was driven to a local veterans hospital in Columbia, where doctors told him he would be permanently blind. There were attempts to hold Linwood Scholl accountable for this violence over the course of years. Orson Welles even got involved in Isaac Woodard's case, but there was never any legal consequence for the police chief. And so as we look at various aspects of public policy in the 20th century, we remember that the 1896 decision by the Supreme Court in Plessy v. Ferguson made separate but equal the law of the land, and that was particularly devastating in the field of education, because it was built upon and perpetuated the underlying assumptions of about Black inferiority and inability. And so in the states of Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Mississippi, there were nearly 5 million African Americans, and more than half of them had less than 5 years of education. In South Carolina and Louisiana, more than 60% had no more than a 4th or 5th grade education. And so in the midst of all of this came about the Supreme Court case known as Brown v. Board of Education, where 5 entities, including Delaware, combined in the case that was filed with the Supreme Court in 1952. At the time, Fred Vinson was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, but he died while the case was pending. And so President Eisenhower named former California Governor Earl Warren to become the new Chief Justice of the United States. Eisenhower was later known to say it was the worst decision that he ever made. Once he had named Earl Warren to the court, Eisenhower hosted a dinner party at the White House to explain to Chief Justice Warren that Southerners, quote, are not bad people. All they are concerned about is to see that their sweet little girls are not required to sit in school alongside big, overgrown Negroes. Well, needless to say, Earl Warren didn't live up to Eisenhower's expectation of his new role. And so the case was decided that schools must be desegregated. Delaware, home to many of us, was a key player in the case and also significantly impacted by the decision, because Blacks had been barred from publicly aided schools in the state of Delaware as early as 1821. And so Black citizens had worked together to build some schools for their children, but they tended to be highly under-resourced, limited electricity, plumbing, desks, supplies. And in fact, by 1950, just before Brown v. Board of Education was filed, there was only one public high school in the state of Delaware that Black students could attend. It was Howard High School in Wilmington. And so if you lived in the far reaches of Newcastle County, let alone Kent or Sussex County, unless you had a family member who lived in the Wilmington area or a friend of the family where you could go and stay, you could not go to high school. And so as a consequence, the average education of a Black youth or adult by 1950 was 7.2 years. Even beyond here, and particularly in the South, but really throughout the country, there was massive resistance to the Brown v. Board of Education decision. And in fact, there was a Brown 2 opinion issued in 1955 that said that this was to be implemented with, quote, all deliberate speed, which really left things up to the states as to how to proceed. Delaware, a judge issued a 12-year delay in implementing Brown v. Board of Education. Prince Edward County in Virginia closed all of their public schools, every single one, from 1959 to 1964. So there was no public school that any white or Black student could attend. Now, white Southern segregationists sent funds to create white academies that some white students could attend, but the impact on children across the board was enormous. Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, and South Carolina declared that the federal courts had no jurisdiction over them, and they weren't paying any attention to this Supreme Court decision. And Georgia repealed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments and voted to impeach the Supreme Court. And so this program in the South became known as the Southern Manifesto, and it was focused on stalling and defying the implementation of this decision. And interestingly, the Alabama state constitution today still mandates that all public schools be segregated. There have been 2 referenda in Alabama seeking to remove that clause from their constitution, one in 2004, one in 2012, and both failed. And so according to the Constitution of Alabama, all schools still must be segregated. And so we saw the stories as heroic Black children and their parents sought to desegregate schools against horrific opposition. The Little Rock 9 attempted to desegregate Central High School in 1957. And even with you see in the back of that photograph, there is a federal marshal there, but the hatred and the vitriol and the potential violence was so overwhelming that eventually the students withdrew from the school. In 1960, little Ruby Bridges desegregated the William Frantz Elementary School in New Orleans. She was one of 6 children, six rising first graders, whose families said that they would allow their children to desegregate the elementary school. But every white parent in the school said they would not allow their children to go to school with these Black children. And so the night before the start of school, Ruby's parents got a phone call that the other 5 sets of parents had decided they couldn't proceed, but Ruby went. Every white teacher, and there were only white teachers in the school, every white teacher save one said they would not have Ruby in their class. The one exception was Barbara Henry, who was living in New Orleans. She had moved there from Boston, and she became Ruby's teacher. But parents wouldn't let their white children attend that class. So for that school year, Barbara Henry and Ruby were the first grade class at William Frantz Elementary. As this happened, her family was forbidden from shopping in the local grocery store. Her father was fired from his job, and her grandparents were evicted from their sharecropping farm. But she made it through. And today, well, since, she has been highly effective civil rights activist. I heard her speak at Smith College a few years ago, and her story of then and the relationship she developed with the 4 federal marshals who escorted her to school every day to keep her safe, and of everything that's happened in her life since, is just extraordinary. She has written a book on the subject. If you ever have a chance to see her, particularly in a video, I highly recommend it. And so her experience was memorialized by Norman Rockwell as a consequence. And now, even today, if we look at the consequences, the 10 states with the lowest level of education in 2021 include Texas, Tennessee, South Carolina, Kentucky, Alabama, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and West Virginia. So in seeking to exclude African Americans from education, the damage has been done to everyone. I'm going to speak just briefly about the interstate highway system. There actually is a whole class on this subject. The interstate highway system was created as a result of the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, while Eisenhower was president. It was the largest public works program in US history, and it authorized construction of 41,000 miles of interstate highways spanning the nation, and authorized $26 billion that would cover 90% of the construction costs. Today, the cost of maintaining this network of roads is $106 billion a year. During that initial construction, more than 475,000 families, more than 1 million people were displaced from their homes, their property seized by eminent domain. And the vast majority of those affected were low-income people of color in urban core areas. And in fact, as fractured communities were unable to maintain relationships and connections between residents and commerce, the economic impact has been huge. And even more, and in addition, the environmental justice issues raised by the construction of these roads going through what had been, in many instances, lower middle class and middle class African-American communities means that the exhaust and the lack of green space is contributing to health issues that are experienced by people who continue to live in those areas. And so now we'll broaden our attention in the 50s and 60s to the civil rights movement, a pivotal time in American history. And part of what intensified the movement was the sudden appearance on TV screens and in periodicals of photographs of dogs attacking people, of fire hoses attacking people, of men on horseback and with billy clubs riding into peaceful marchers. And it raised the consciousness of people in the nation in a way that had not occurred in many instances before most people had television sets. And it's not unlike what we see happening now with the availability of cell phone videos. During this period, 1950 to 1975, 150 new Confederate monuments were erected in cities across the country, largely in the South, but not exclusively. And during this time period, as you see from these photographs, law enforcement agencies aligned themselves with the power of white people seeking to continue to deny civil rights to African Americans. And that alliance between police and the white power structure shapes today's relationships between police and communities of color. One of the signature events that triggered the outrage over racism and impelled the civil rights movement was the murder of Emmett Till. Emmett was a 14-year-old boy from Chicago who went to visit his family in Money, Mississippi in August of 1955. And he and his cousins went to the Bryant General Store, and apparently Emmett whistled at Mrs. Bryant or said something that was considered verboten in the South. And they went home. J.W. Bryant, Mrs. Bryant's husband, was away, but when he came home 4 days later, she told him she had been assaulted by Emmett. And so Roy Bryant and his brother-in-law, J.W. Milam, went to Emmett's uncle's house that night and demanded that Emmett come with them. And he disappeared. And nothing was heard of him for several days until his body surfaced in the Tallahatchie River. There was a fan blade from a cotton gin tied around his neck with barbed wire. And he had been submerged in the river for quite some time. His mother, Mamie Till, back in Chicago, against all advice from her friends and family, declared that there would be an open casket funeral for Emmett so that the world could see what racism and hatred had done to her boy. And Jet magazine published a photograph of Emmett that had, as you might expect, a significant impact on people's understanding of the damage that was being done. And so following that, in 1955, the Montgomery bus boycott took place. It lasted for over a year. 99% of Black residents boycotted the bus system, which meant that it really could not continue to function. And along with a related case, Browder v. Gale, the Supreme Court did declare that the segregated spaces on buses was unconstitutional. In 1960, sit-ins took place across the country, but most notably in Greensboro, North Carolina, where well-dressed, well-behaved African-American youth and young adults sat quietly at lunch counters, and over the course of 6 months were assaulted with mustard and ketchup and milk and hot coffee and pulled off stools and kicked and beaten. And finally, the lunch counters were desegregated in July of that year. There were so many people who stepped forward to take risks to say, this cannot continue. In 1961, the Freedom Rides began, and one of the first ones stopped in Anniston, Alabama on May 14th that year. And when it stopped, white residents shot out the tires of the bus so that it could not move. And then they threw a gasoline bomb into the back of the bus. As the passengers struggled to escape out the front door, they were met with rioters who beat them with clubs. Oprah Winfrey had a reunion of the Freedom Riders. There's a video of it, very powerful. And one of the things that she did was she brought forward a then young white girl who, when she saw what was happening, took water and bandages and helped the Freedom Riders who had been attacked so that they would not suffer as much as they would have otherwise. 1963 was the famous March on Washington. We know it as a source of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, but he also spoke powerfully about economic issues for African Americans and the need for jobs. That kind of got lost in translation, particularly later on. But that same year, on September 15th at 10:22 in the morning, in the 16th Street Baptist Church, they were preparing for Youth Sunday when 19 sticks of dynamite that had been planted by 4 members of the Ku Klux Klan exploded and killed Addie Mae Collins, Carol Robinson, Cynthia Wesley, and Denise McNair. Addie's cousin Sarah was blinded in the attack. The 4 men who did it were quite vocal about their role, but they were never even brought to trial. The first time any one of them was tried was in 1977. A second was tried in 2001 and a third in 2002, and the 4th man died before he could be tried. But there was little to no justice in all of this. And as we come to the end of what we think of as this phase of the civil rights movement, in 1964, 3 men, Andrew Goodman, James Chaney, and Michael Schwerner, were trying to extend voting rights and get people to register to vote and to vote. And the police made a traffic stop and killed the 3 men and buried their bodies in a shallow grave nearby, where they were discovered and the photographs shown, but no consequences to the police. Yet that year, Congress passed the landmark Civil Rights Act. In 1965, the famous Selma to Montgomery March, in which John Lewis participated, and I think with his recent death, many of us have been seeing again the march that occurred as they attempted to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And despite that violence, or perhaps encouraged by it, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act. And we will hear more about the Voting Rights Act in 2 weeks when we talk about voter suppression and the Shelby County v. Holder decision by the Supreme Court in 2013. And this period we're discussing comes to an end in 1968 with the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy. So it was a highly turbulent time. Much was accomplished. And like Reconstruction, it offered hope for the future. And we owe deep gratitude to so many heroic civil rights activists during this time.
So, friends, questions, questions for Sue. That was a lot. That was powerful. So if you want to hit your little raise your hand button, I will just be quiet and let that absorb for a moment. And as you guys have questions, just go ahead and raise your hand and I'll start acknowledging you. I see Diana has a question. Your camera's off, Diana, but we can hear you if you unmute.
Okay. I had my camera off because I was eating lunch. It's interesting to me how primarily with the southern states and the education or lack of education or lower numbers of education, primarily in the South, how it seems like they've almost they shot themselves in the foot. I mean, and it's coming back on them. And an old saying that my father said, you know, you made your bed, now you got to lay in it. But yet things are still not getting better. They want to stick to their guns with what they've done in the past for whatever reason. But it's like, you're not just hurting the Black population, you're hurting everybody. And they just want to know, this is the way we've always done it. This is the way we're going to stay. Doesn't make sense to me.
There's a powerful new book by an author named Heather McGhee. It's called The Sum of Us, and it's how racism hurts everyone. I've heard her speak, a video. She's an economist, actually, calls herself a policy wonk. And her primary headline example, was after desegregation was enforced. It was at a point in time when municipalities had public swimming pools. There was basically no air conditioning. There weren't private backyard pools. And so lots of cities had large public pools. And when they were ordered to desegregate, a number of cities drained the pools, filled them with cement, that if they were going to have to let Black people swim, then nobody was going to swim. And that's sort of her metaphor for the actions that have been taken. And she's been traveling around the country and talking to people of all economic levels, particularly lower class, lower middle class, about their hopes and dreams and what's happening, and finding such common desires and goals. And if there are ways to make clear how these decisions are harming everyone, perhaps there are ways to make progress in doing well for everyone. She points out that all of this is not a zero-sum game. Many would have you think it is. And if someone else gets something, it means I lose something. And her point is, for so many of these policies and programs, it isn't zero sum, and there are ways to make programs work for everyone. So I hope she gets lots of attention. I hope that there is an increased focus on how we can do better for everyone.
Yes, Susan, and then Donna, and then Sue Loney.
Hi, I am actually a public school teacher in Kentucky, so I can provide a little bit of perhaps encouragement in that regard. And while I can't speak for every district in Kentucky, I can tell you that the professional development that my district is doing this year includes a collaborative on culturally responsive teaching and the brain and the neuroscience of how our biases affect our students. And while that doesn't eliminate some of the historically systemic and unfairness that has occurred and still does occur in places, it does shed some light on the fact that there is an awareness and there is definitely a dedication to doing better for all of our kids.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. And I do think that the attention that is being paid to this kind of across the country is like planting little seeds places. You know, it didn't happen overnight. It isn't going away overnight, and it isn't going to happen because of some grand proclamation. It's going to be classes like that, programs like that, and to the extent to which we each, wherever we are, can look for and support those kinds of initiatives, we can make a difference. That we don't have to ride a bus and have the tires shot out. We can do things that are meaningful. And I'm really glad to hear that, Susan. Thank you.
Yeah, Donna Darty. Don't forget, there you go.
Sue, I haven't had a chance to thank you for what you're doing in educating us, me. I grew up in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. I've been here almost 18 years. I'm 65. I grew up, let me just share a couple things with you. First of all, I was first reminded of the story in the Old Testament about if I can find, and Patrick helped me with this, how many who will repent? If even one repents, will you not destroy the city? My first question, was there not even one state that treated Blacks rightly, fairly, as they should have been? Not even one? Was this all across our nation?
There certainly were degrees. Certainly were degrees. And I don't pretend to know what all of the particulars are. I know there are states like Hawaii. The first time I was there, Bob and I were walking in Honolulu and said, we're in the minority here. But there was no majority. There was a wide-ranging group of ethnic groups. I think Hawaii has its own issues about caste, if you will. So it frequently involves Black people or African Americans, but it can, it can involve other groups as well. There are certainly municipalities, there are states that strive to do better. So it's not all painted with the same depth of color. But clearly there have been messages conveyed that impact us all, whether we're even aware of it. I took a class 45 years ago at DuPont, where the two Black facilitators from San Francisco said, you cannot have grown up in the United States in the 20th century and not be prejudiced against Black people. You cannot. It's not because you're a bad person. It's not even because you consciously think something, but you have been just inundated with messages, many of them unconscious, subliminal, and you have absorbed them. And it doesn't make you a bad person that you have them. What matters is that when they surface, you recognize them for what they are and you make a decision on how you're going to act. The author and speaker, author of White Fragility, his name has just gone right out of my mind.
Robin DiAngelo.
Thank you. Robin DiAngelo was giving a talk, and she said, I am just as prejudiced as Donald Trump. And there was this gasp in the audience. It was like, how could you say that? And she said, I've absorbed the same message as he has. I have gotten all of that, but I have done something different with it. But at heart, I heard it all.
You know, one of the things I wanted to share when we talk about the South, there are those of us who grew up in the South who were raised to love one another regardless of color, what faith you were, what part of the city you lived in. I grew up, my father died when I was 17 months old, and the only person that I know of in our town, and this is from a child's memory, please understand, who when my mother called on to do any kind of repair work at our home, it was a Black gentleman named Bill Samuels with whom she worked at NCR. And he would come to our house, and he was the only one who did not gouge her price-wise for anything. He would bring his children over, my little brother and I would play with the kids, but we were all about the same age, and Bill would do whatever he needed to do in our home, and Mama paid him, and we played with the kids, and on they went. When I was in the 8th grade, no, I'm sorry, in the 7th grade, a young man named Bill Scales ran for school president. He was one of 3 Black kids in our school, and he was overwhelmingly elected as our school president. So when he was a 9th grader, we recognized that this young man had such leadership potential. In desegregation in the 70s, in my high school, when they changed I guess how many years you were in a high school, where they went, it used to be 6, 3, and 3, and then it went 5, 2, 2, 2, whatever they did. By the time I was a senior in high school, we were down to 2 years of grades in that school. And one of the schools across town had a lot of issues with race relations. And there were some white guys going around to the different schools and trying to cause trouble. And I remember our football team, our Black and white football players, locked down the school, and they were posted at all the different entrances into the school. The kids were in the classrooms locked, and those boys forbid anyone from coming in that school. Now, mind me, it wasn't the police that stopped them. It was the football players. It was those young men who believed in their heart of hearts that we weren't going to be a part of anything negative that we had any control over. Those were kids, and I was proud of those kids. So
I'm glad you had those experiences,
you.
Donna. That's great. Thank you for sharing.
Next is the wonderful and talented Sue Loney.
Thank you, Patrick. I want to go back to the part where you were talking about property ownership. So Kevin and I live over in North Wilmington off of Falk Road in a neighborhood that was built at the end of the Second World War. Our house is 1951, and there were deed restrictions back then that prohibited, I don't remember the language anymore, but I remember being shocked when I saw the original deed restrictions that prohibited African Americans from buying in this neighborhood. So, I mean, that's just shocking to me. That seems like it comes from ancient American history, but it comes from my neighborhood, you know, when my parents were buying houses. I just have like a stream of consciousness here, and maybe there will be a question at the end. I can remember listening to like a long narrative piece on NPR probably a year and a half ago. And that was the first time I had been introduced to the idea of what redlining was and how it actually worked. And the notion you talked about, the contracts for deeds, where upstanding, honest, civic-minded African-American families could in good conscience enter into a contract to purchase a home. And then through any, stuff happens, you miss a payment, and they would lose everything that they had paid in. Whereas a white family in the same situation, might get dinged on their credit score in the way that that was eye-opening to me. And it made me completely rethink. A couple of years before, I had read the Ta-Nehisi Coates article in The Atlantic, or the essay in The Atlantic, The Case for Reparations. And I always thought that was really just an ideal pie in the sky idea, the notion of reparations. And then I learned more about that. The economic injustices just in our housing markets. If you think about the city of Wilmington, where does I-95 go? Right through? It doesn't go through the heart of Greenville. It goes through the center of the city. So I don't know if there's a question here. Maybe my question is, are there groups, are there people in Delaware, like Start at Home, that are seriously thinking about reparations is such a freighted word, but are seriously thinking about economic amend making in ways that are actually actionable and not just idealistic?
I think there are, Sue. And just one comment to begin. When the decision was made for I-95 to go through Wilmington, they had the choice of the route that it currently takes or the route that 495 or whatever takes. No. That would not have displaced really anybody. But the city council, in a lame duck session, because they had not been reelected, by one vote, selected the route through the city. And so the consequence of that has been huge compared to what would have happened had the road simply skirted Wilmington instead of going right smack through that neighborhood, and the consequences you see every time you drive into Wilmington in terms of what happened. There are a lot of groups looking at a whole range of reparations in the sense of countering the economic impacts. If you have not read Ta-Nehisi Coates' essay, it was in the April 2014, I think, issue of The Atlantic, and you can find it online. You don't have to have a subscription. It's long, it's powerful. But fundamentally what it says is if there are policies that have caused economic harm, then the reparation should help address that economic harm. And so additional investment in schools. If the schools have not been able to deliver quality education, then additional resources need to be provided for those schools. If Black-owned businesses left in the city are struggling, then some sort of economic support for them is appropriate. If you had been unable to purchase a house, then 0% mortgages with some sort of subsidy or support would help address it. So there's not a reparations commission per se, but there are people looking at how can we help rectify some of the economic consequences that have resulted from past policies and past performance. And then there are a whole range of programs that are being considered and implemented in legislative action addressing the criminal justice system in Wilmington, which is in fact a significant reparations event, if you will. Does that answer your question?
I think so. I mean, at least it starts people thinking, right? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and Pastor Sue, just to your point about the deed restrictions and everything, North Wilmington, from my work that I used to do before I was a pastor, North Wilmington is riddled with them, far more than any other section of Newcastle County, only because of when it was developed, kind of post-World War II. They're throughout. I mean, they're in Mill Creek 100 as well, and in Newport and those kinds of areas. But primarily, I saw them mostly up in that area. We had a policy in our office that when those deed restrictions came up, when we were preparing the new deed, that we left them out because they're no longer in effect. So just to try to begin to let them move their way into posterity and pull them out. But I know there were some attorneys that left them in there, even though they didn't need to anymore.
I lived in North Wilmington. My parents built a house in Carcroft in 1953. And it was kind of the last houses built along Marsh Road at that time. But a little bit later on, other developments came about. And a friend of my sister, my younger sister Nancy's, Margot Levering, her father was a real estate agent in Delaware. And he sold a house to a Black couple in Collins Park, the first sale to a non-white person in Collins Park. And the demonstrations on March Road and the cross burnings on the Levering's front lawn, or I think I was 10. And you would see these people with clubs and torches and Marsh Road, you know, it was just mind-boggling without even comprehending all of what it was about. Yeah.
Sue, were you going to follow up on?
Yeah, I wanted to say that Good Shepherd has a long time member, and her family was the first to integrate one of the neighborhoods right around Good Shepherd. And they had the builder gave them a choice, and the builder was sort of working with them. And the builder gave them a choice of this neighborhood or that neighborhood, and they chose that neighborhood because the first neighborhood had no main streets. It was Chalfont, if you know North Wilmington. And it was, all tiny streets that connected. And if trouble happened and they had to get out, it would be hard to get out in a hurry because, you have to drive through all the roads that wave around. And so they built where they built, and they're on one of the major thoroughfares in North Wilmington. And she has terrifying stories of BBs and bullets and other things being shot into her house in late 50, 1960 something, in Brandywine 100. And again, I feel like, what? I was a little girl here then. It's horrifying to me. That's not a question, but it goes to your point. This stuff isn't that far removed from us, and it happened right here.
Yeah.
And our churches don't know this. Our super very white churches don't know this part of our own history. I say that as a daughter of Good Shepherd, not just one of their pastors right now.
And we have Elizabeth with her hand raised.
Okay.
Sorry, Sue, did you want to?
No.
Okay, Elizabeth?
Yeah, I just wanted to amplify what Sue's talking about in a way, is bought my house in Brooklyn Terrace, which is right near Price's Corner, across from Marburg School. It's a little old development. We bought the house in 1970. And the reason we bought, I wanted to be I was the roaring liberal from Southern California. And I wanted to live in an integrated school. We didn't have any kids, but I wanted my kids to go to an integrated school. So Marshallton McCain School District was integrated at that point. And, they had all the first and second graders were in one school, but hardly any of the other districts in Delaware did that. But anyway, we moved in, and I didn't really know. It was an area, where we could afford a little old development. And I found out a couple of years, I didn't realize initially it was an all white neighborhood. And so that came up at a civics club meeting, and I was like horrified because somebody had somebody visit their house. And there was an objection on the floor that was brought up about, and I was like, excuse me. And they were like, well, the next thing you know, somebody's going to be moving in. And I'm like, whoa, whoa, whoa. You know, and I'm like, that's okay. It's illegal to not, you know, and they were like, well, anyway, and they said, well, and then somebody, this one person, the guy, anyway, who was also roaring liberal, she was like, well, you know, if you look at your deed, you know, the deed restrictions. And I was like, you're kidding. And I went home and by God, like it was there, you know, and I was like, and they were like, oh no, but it doesn't matter. You know, and so we did something one time and I was like, I want that off of that. I don't care how much it costs, you get it off of my deed, you know, kind of a deal. But I am happy to say that we have this neighborhood now is very diverse. And I like to think that I had a little bit to do with that in terms of the civic association and making everybody feel welcome and putting out fires, you know, here and there occasionally, but and I think we're the better for it. We're, you know, we're diverse in all kinds of ways. We've got all kinds of different, you know, ethnic groups and all kinds of socioeconomic groups also, you know, which has always been a real point of pride kind of with Brooklyn Terrace. But, and the only other thing I was going to say is, I don't know, something with the educator. I always felt like, what can we do? And one thing to me, as those of us that are grandparents, is I never buy a book that has a group of children in it unless there's diversity. I always look at any book I buy for anybody, you know, and I buy a lot of books because I'm a retired educator, but is that I always make sure that it has diversity and that the message is a good message. That's it.
Okay, I don't see any other hands, Sue. So I think, Sue, do you have anything else that you wanted to close with? Are you good?
I'm just so glad that you're all here. I appreciate the dialogue and the discussion. Our 6th class is going to be, where do we go from here? And that's the question of what is it that we're going to do. So next week, we'll be focusing on the criminal justice system. The title is Mass Incarceration and the War on Drugs, but it is more broadly associated with criminal justice. And from there, we'll go to voter suppression then and now. And now means like today and tomorrow. So I appreciate you being here and I look forward to seeing you next week.
Yeah, thank you, Sue.
Thank you, Sue.
We'll see everybody next week.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Sue.
Thank you.